At 9:23 in the morning on June 14, 2025, the USS Princeton was doing what American warships have done in the South China Sea for decades, conducting a freedom of navigation patrol through international waters where $3.5 trillion in annual trade flows with clockwork reliability. Routine, professional, transparent. The kind of naval presence that keeps the world's most important shipping lanes open so that cargo moves, economies function, and the rules that govern international waters remain something more than suggestions. Then her spy radar painted something that changed the morning considerably. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer that had been loitering 200 kilometers out suddenly accelerated from 18 to 30 knots in under 90 seconds. Not the gradual increase of a ship adjusting its transit course, or a deliberate, committed push toward the American formation. Inside the Princeton's Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the Chinese destroyer's vector update on his display and understood immediately what it meant. Someone in Beijing had just given an order. What the Americans didn't know yet was the exact nature of that order. What Beijing's commanders had sent to the destroyer Jiangzhun's captain was specific and unambiguous. Intercept the Americans and make them blink first. The calculation behind that order reflected a particular theory about American resolve, that the United States, facing a confrontation in waters China claimed as its own, would choose de-escalation over confrontation, would yield rather than risk a broader incident, would blink. Beijing was about to learn why that theory was wrong. For the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group had been operating in the South China Sea with the confidence that comes from 75 years of uncontested blue water dominance. 104,600 tons of carrier, 90 aircraft, and a ring of escort vessels whose combined firepower represented the single most capable naval formation in the history of warfare. They were 180 nautical miles from the nearest Chinese territory in international waters, doing nothing that required explanation or justification. The mission was freedom of navigation, the principle, recognized under international law for centuries, that the high seas belong to everyone, and no nation has the right to exclude others from them. China's position, asserted with increasing aggression over the preceding decade, was that the South China Sea was effectively Chinese territorial water, and that the United States Navy's presence there was a provocation requiring a response. The United States Navy's position, consistent since the first freedom of navigation operation in these waters, was that the law applies to everyone including China, that international waters are international, and that the way you demonstrate that principle is by sailing through them with the same professional confidence you'd bring to any other ocean on the planet. By 9:26, target classification was complete. The radar operators had positively identified the Type 052D destroyer, a capable modern Chinese surface combatant, and assigned it a threat assessment of moderate to high. The Jiangzhun's YJ-18 anti-ship missiles had the range to threaten the Princeton from their current separation. That was the concerning part. The less concerning part, at least from the American perspective, was the Princeton's SM-6 missiles, in surface mode, which could engage targets at 240 nautical miles and had a demonstrated probability of kill against exactly the kind of weapons the Chinese destroyer was carrying. The math was asymmetric in a direction that favored the Americans significantly. At the Jiangzhun's current speed and heading, she would reach weapons engagement range in 17 minutes. The Princeton's captain was asked for his assessment of probable Chinese intent. His response reflected the specific confidence of a man who has done this calculation and knows how it comes out. And let's see how badly they want to embarrass themselves first. The broader tactical picture complicated things in ways that went beyond pure military calculation. The South China Sea at that moment contained 46 commercial vessels within 50 miles of the American formation. A Singapore-flagged container ship loaded with semiconductors. A South Korean LNG tanker representing $200 million in cargo and hull value. Merchant traffic from a dozen nations, transiting international waters in the reasonable expectation that those waters were governed by law rather than by the preferences of whichever regional power felt most assertive that week. Every one of those ships depended on the American presence to mean something. If Beijing succeeded in using naval intimidation to effectively claim jurisdiction over these waters, and the consequences extended far beyond any single confrontation, they reached into every shipping lane, every trade relationship, every economy that depended on freedom of passage through the South China Sea. None of that would be Beijing's problem if they could actually win the confrontation. They couldn't. But they didn't know that yet. At 9:30, the Princeton's cooperative engagement capability automatically shared the complete threat picture across every ship in the strike group. The Nimitz herself adjusted her flight operations with the efficiency of a system that has been running this particular drill for decades. The destroyers Chung-hoon and Kidd shifted positions to tighten the defensive ring around the carrier. Every ship in the formation now had the same tactical picture, updated in real time, and every weapon system in the formation was tracking the same threats from the same data set. The Chinese formation, operating on voice communications and individual sensors, was fighting with information that was already old by the time it reached the crew members who needed to act on it. At 9:35, the tactical picture added a new dimension. The E-2D Hawkeye orbiting at 25,000 feet, providing the aerial surveillance coverage that the Americans called the God's View, a radar horizon extending 400 miles in every direction, detected multiple aircraft launching from the Chinese carrier Shandong. Radar signatures consistent with J-15 fighters, climbing hard and heading south toward the American formation. The air controllers noted something immediately. The J-15s were struggling to gain altitude. The Shandong uses a ski jump launch ramp rather than the electromagnetic catapult system that equips American carriers. And the physics of ski jump launches impose a direct constraint on what an aircraft can carry. Without catapult assistance, a J-15 leaves the deck with reduced fuel and reduced weapons load, sacrificing either range or weapons capacity or both. The Chinese aircraft were already at an energy disadvantage before they had closed any of the distance between themselves and the American fighters that would be waiting for them. 1 minute later, the sonar operators added the final piece of the Chinese coordination picture, a possible submerged contact at 80 nautical miles. Acoustic signature consistent with a Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. The sonar operators noted, with the particular professional derision that submarine specialists reserve for loud contacts, that the Chinese boat was making noise that a competent crew would have found mortifying. Diesel-electric submarines are supposed to be quiet. Their entire operational concept depends on acoustic stealth. This one was broadcasting its position with the subtlety of a freight train. What Beijing was orchestrating, as the Americans now understood it completely, was a multi-domain intimidation campaign involving surface ships, carrier aircraft, and a submarine. The theory of the operation was presumably that the coordination of threats across 3 domains would be overwhelming enough to force an American response that could be characterized as aggression, or restraint that could be characterized as weakness, with Beijing claiming a political victory in either case. The practical execution of that theory was a Chinese destroyer that was badly outmatched by its target, J-15IS, that had launched with compromised fuel and weapons loads from a carrier that couldn't match American catapult capability, and a submarine so acoustically loud that the Americans had been tracking it for the better part of an hour before its captain apparently realized he needed to get closer. The United States Navy had been perfecting blue water dominance continuously since 1914. What the Chinese forces were about to discover was not simply that they were outgunned. That much was calculable before any of this began. What they were about to discover was the specific, systematic nature of exactly how outgunned they were. At 9:37, the Nimitz's flight deck entered the controlled, precisely choreographed operational tempo that American carrier aviation has spent decades perfecting. F/A, 18E Super Hornets from VFA-14, the top hatters, left the catapults at 45-second intervals. The electromagnetic catapult system accelerates an aircraft from 0 to launch speed with consistent, controllable force that can be precisely matched to the aircraft's weight and configuration, allowing a fully loaded Super Hornet to leave the deck at combat weight with full fuel and a complete weapons load. The 1st Division climbed through 15,000 feet with their AN/APG-79 active electronically scanned array radars already painting the incoming J-15S at maximum range. The technological asymmetry was substantial. The APG-79 uses thousands of individual transmit-receive modules to generate a radar beam that can be shaped, directed, and managed electronically in fractions of a second, tracking multiple targets simultaneously while being extraordinarily difficult for an adversary to detect or jam. The J-15S carried mechanically scanned radars that swept back and forth through their coverage zone like a lighthouse, broadcasting their emissions on a predictable pattern to anyone with the sensors to detect them. The American pilots knew the Chinese aircraft were there long before the Chinese pilots had reliable information about American positions. Every FA-18 in the formation was connected via Link 16, sharing sensor data in real time across the entire formation. When one aircraft detected something, all of them detected it. When Chinese pilots coordinated through voice communications and individual sensors, each aircraft effectively operating on its own tactical picture rather than a shared one. The gap this created in combat effectiveness was not measured in marginal capability differences. It was the difference between a networked team with a shared, continuously updated common operational picture and a collection of individually capable aircraft trying to coordinate through a system that was already obsolete before the engagement began. The EA-18G Growlers entered the fight without launching a weapon. Their ALQ-99 jamming systems began operating at range, flooding the frequency bands that the Chinese formation depended on for radar, communications, and data links. On Chinese radar screens, the picture began to deteriorate. Ghost contacts appeared by the dozens. American fighters materialized and disappeared. What looked like 4 FA-18Us multiplied into apparent squadrons that reformed and dissolved. Chinese radar locks broke before solutions could be refined. J-15 pilots found themselves reacting to phantom contacts, while real threats maneuvered in the space between the electronic noise. The American fighters executed a tactical formation called the Wall, high elements at 35,000 feet, medium at 25,000, low at 15,000, creating overlapping engagement zones with mutual support built into every layer. Anywhere the Chinese formation moved, they were entering someone's weapons envelope. The J-15S, by contrast, had remained grouped, a necessity when data links can't support distributed operations and pilots have to maintain visual contact to coordinate. Predictable, observable, concentrated in a way that made the formation's next move readable before they executed it. At 9:43, the RSI 135 rivet joint that had been conducting electronic intelligence collection for 6 hours provided the information that captured what was actually happening inside the Chinese command structure. The aircraft's linguists, monitoring Chinese military communications, reported that J-15 pilots were requesting permission from their chain of command before conducting aggressive maneuvers. They were asking Beijing for clearance to buzz the American ships. American pilots trained to seize tactical initiative found this revealing. By the time Beijing evaluated the request, consulted with whatever political authority needed to be consulted, and transmitted approval back to the pilots, the tactical situation would have changed multiple times. The Americans were operating on a decision cycle that was orders of magnitude faster than anything their adversaries could match. The Chinese were conducting a bureaucratically managed confrontation against an opponent who had delegated tactical authority to the people in the cockpits. On the surface, the situation was reaching its critical point. At 9:47, the Jiangxun's Type 346A phased array radar shifted from search mode to fire control tracking, locking onto the USS Nimitz with the kind of precision that in naval warfare means one thing. A fire control lock is the electromagnetic equivalent of placing a weapon against someone's head and applying pressure to the trigger without completing the pull. It is one step below actual weapons release. It is, under the rules of engagement that govern naval operations, the kind of act that justifies an immediate defensive response. Inside the Princeton's Combat Information Center, the response was immediate in its assessment and measured in its execution. The American crew understood what the fire control lock meant. They also understood something the Chinese appeared to be counting on: that American restraint, drilled through decades of professional development and exercised through countless confrontations exactly like this one, would hold even under direct provocation. What Beijing had apparently calculated was that restraint equated to inability, that if the Americans didn't respond to a fire control lock with immediate action, it demonstrated that they couldn't respond effectively. What it actually demonstrated was that the Princeton's crew didn't need to respond to a fire control lock with weapons, because every firing solution on the Jiangxun had been continuously updated. For the past 30 minutes, the Chinese destroyer was tracked by multiple systems from multiple platforms simultaneously, and the outcome of an exchange between a Type 052D destroyer and a full carrier strike group was not a variable that required more information to resolve. The Princeton's own fire control radars remained in standby. Her 122 vertical launch cells held SM-6 missiles that could reach 240 kilometers. SM-2 missiles in surface engagement mode. ASROC anti-submarine weapons. The complete inventory of American surface warfare capability, none of it activated, all of it ready. Every firing solution updated continuously against the Chinese destroyer that had just electronically pointed its weapons at the largest aircraft carrier in the world. The fire control lock lasted exactly 30 seconds, long enough to make the claim that they had demonstrated capability, not long enough to trigger the automatic self-defense responses that American doctrine, rules of engagement, and the physics of missile flight times combined to require. It was a precisely calibrated provocation, aggressive enough to claim as a demonstration of resolve, short enough to stop before the Americans were legally and operationally required to respond with weapons. The Princeton's crew documented everything: signal characteristics, timing, bearing data. All of it recorded with the specificity that makes such documentation useful in contexts that extend beyond the current confrontation. In the air, a J-15 pilot made the individual decision to conduct an aggressive intercept, diving toward an FA-18 in the kind of close pass maneuver that fighter pilots use to demonstrate that they're willing to accept risk. The American pilot, trained in exactly this scenario at Naval Air Station Fallon and at Top Gun, responded with the technique appropriate to the situation. He rolled inverted and pulled into the Chinese fighter's 6 o'clock position, directly behind the aircraft in the weapons employment zone that every fighter pilot spends their career either protecting against or achieving. For 3 seconds, the American pilot had a firing solution. His helmet-mounted display showed the J-15's engines in infrared. An AIM-9X Sidewinder launched from that position against that target would have had a kill probability that the Chinese pilot would have found unpleasant to contemplate. The American pilot did not fire. Professional discipline, drilled until it was automatic, held. The moment passed. Both aircraft continued, but the Chinese pilot now knew something he hadn't known 30 seconds earlier about the tactical situation he was operating in. The submarine element of the Chinese coordination completed its contribution to the afternoon's education at 9:51, when the Type 039 boat raised its snorkel to recharge batteries. The Princeton's SQQ-89 sonar suite had been tracking this contact for more than an hour. Acoustic signature cataloged, position known to within meters, firing solution continuously updated. The snorkel evolution made the boat's position precise and its activity pattern clear. The TAO's assessment was direct. If this situation became kinetic, the Chinese submarine captain would have approximately 12 seconds to consider his tactical options before an ASROC reached him. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Nimitz launched the largest single-carrier air power demonstration the South China Sea had seen in years. 48 aircraft in the air simultaneously, each Super Hornets loaded with live weapons. EA-18G Growlers carrying electronic warfare packages whose combined output could functionally blind a regional air defense network. E-2D Hawkeyes taking the high ground and commanding the aerial surveillance picture across hundreds of miles in every direction. The Growlers went to full power. Chinese radar screens across the formation degraded simultaneously. The Shandong's air defense picture, already stressed by the earlier jamming, became operationally unusable. False contacts appeared by the hundreds. Real aircraft disappeared into electronic noise. Chinese controllers couldn't distinguish genuine threats from the electromagnetic environment the Growlers were manufacturing. Well, everything looked like a threat, because the system processing the radar returns could no longer reliably tell the difference between a real return and a manufactured one. Then the submarine surfaced. The Virginia-class attack submarine had been shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 days. Silent, undetected. Operating inside the Chinese formation's entire anti-submarine screen. The helicopters, the sonobuoys, the hull-mounted sonar, without being found. 8 days of intelligence collection, position tracking, and continuous tactical monitoring that the Chinese had no awareness of. At 3:47 in the afternoon, she surfaced 6 nautical miles from the Shandong, close enough for Chinese lookouts to see her clearly, close enough for the photographers aboard the Chinese ships to take photographs that would document the moment with perfect clarity. The message required no translation. The most capable submarine force in the world had spent 8 days inside the Chinese formation's defensive screen without being detected. If the situation had been a shooting war, the Shandong would already have been gone. Not at the moment the submarine surfaced, but at whatever point during the preceding 8 days its commanding officer had chosen to act. The surfacing was theater, but it was theater built on a foundation of operational reality that the Chinese could verify with their own sensors. They hadn't found the submarine had found them. And then, having been seen, having allowed the Chinese to document its presence with their own cameras, it slid back beneath the surface and disappeared. The underwater domain, like the air above and the surface around them, belonged to the Americans. In the air, the fuel mathematics that had been accumulating against the J-15 ASIOS since their ski jump launches from the Shandong reached their operational conclusion. The Chinese fighters, already compromised by reduced fuel loads at launch and further depleted by the hard climb to altitude and the maneuvering they had conducted through the afternoon, found themselves unable to maintain the engagement. One by one, they broke off, returning to the Shandong with fuel states that left no margin for error. Some landed with emergency fuel quantities that fighter pilots in normal operations would treat as a training incident requiring a post-flight debrief. The Chinese carrier's flight deck recovered the aircraft that had launched to demonstrate Chinese air power and had instead demonstrated the operational constraints imposed by a launch system that couldn't give them what they needed to do the job they'd been sent to do. At 4:23 in the afternoon, the Shandong Carrier Strike Group began its withdrawal. The official Chinese communications described the day's activities as the completion of scheduled exercises. Everyone involved understood what had actually happened. A Chinese naval formation had come to the South China Sea to demonstrate that Chinese naval power had reached the level where it could challenge the United States Navy in open water, to intimidate lawful navigation in international waters, to assert effective control over sea lanes that international law designated as open to all nations. What they had demonstrated instead was a comprehensive accounting of the gap between Chinese naval capability as it existed and Chinese naval capability as Beijing's strategic communications had described it. A carrier that couldn't launch aircraft at full combat load, fighters that ran low on fuel before the engagement concluded, a submarine so acoustically compromised that the Americans had been tracking it for an hour before it made its move, surface combatants whose fire control systems were outranged and outmatched by the weapons pointed at them from a formation they could not damage. And opposite all of that, an American carrier strike group that had conducted the entire engagement without firing a single weapon, without activating a single fire control radar in offensive mode, without breaking formation discipline or responding to provocations with anything except the professional confidence of a force that had done this math before the Chinese ships left port and already knew the answer. The Freedom of Navigation Patrol continued. The 46 commercial vessels within 50 miles of the American formation continued their transits. The Singapore-flagged container ship loaded with semiconductors proceeded on its course. The South Korean LNG tanker maintained its speed and heading. $3.5 trillion in annual trade continued to flow through the sea lanes that the United States Navy had spent 75 years ensuring remained open, governed by law rather than by the preferences of whichever regional power felt most assertive on any given morning. The Jiangxun turned west and reduced speed. The J-15S landed aboard the Shandong with empty tanks and nothing to show for it. The Type 039 submarine proceeded to wherever its orders sent it next, carrying the knowledge that it had spent its entire approach to the American formation being tracked by sensors it couldn't detect and couldn't defeat. The Virginia-class submarine that had surfaced long enough to be photographed and then disappeared had delivered its message with the specificity that only demonstrated operational capability can achieve. Beijing had wanted to know if the Americans would blink. The Americans had not blinked. They had not raised their voices. They had not broken formation. They had not activated weapon systems they didn't need to activate to make their point clear. They had simply been what they were, the most capable naval force in the history of organized warfare, operating in international waters where they had every legal and operational right to be, doing exactly what freedom of navigation operations are designed to do, demonstrating, through presence rather than words, that the rules governing international waters apply to everyone, that the South China Sea belongs to the world's shipping lanes, not to Beijing's strategic ambitions, and that the United States Navy's answer to the question of who controls these waters has been the same answer for 75 years. The afternoon light was changing when the last Chinese aircraft recovered aboard the Shandong. The American formation held its position. The Nimitz's flight deck reset for the next cycle. The Princeton's radar operators tracked the departing Chinese ships until they were well outside engagement range and continued tracking them after that, because that's what you do. Somewhere beneath the surface of the South China Sea, a Virginia-class submarine that 8 days of Chinese anti-submarine operations had completely failed to locate, went back to doing what it had been doing before anyone surfaced it for the cameras. The South China Sea returned to its routine. The shipping lanes stayed open. The law held. It had never really been in question.